Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the greatest economic and environmental double blow in American history. We're going to treat the 1930s like a complex mystery that, honestly, we're still trying to solve today. Because, when you really look closely at the data, the traditional story we've all been told about the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, well, it completely misses some truly fascinating and frankly terrifying details.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, a perfect global storm. Then, the anatomy of economic collapse. Third, the Dust Bowl and land ethic. Fourth, the New Deal debate. And finally, the long-term scars.
All right, Section 1, a perfect global storm. To really grasp the sheer scale of the desperation, listen to this quote by modern economist Nancy E. Rose. She wrote, "The unemployed are selling apples on street corners, while food is rotting in the fields because the farmers cannot sell it." Just imagine the crazy paradox of that for a second. You literally have millions of people going hungry, scraping by in cardboard homes, while at the exact same time, basic necessities like crops are just rotting away in the dirt. Why? Well, because the financial mechanisms that connect supply to demand had completely, utterly disintegrated. And it's so crucial to understand, this wasn't just an isolated American crisis. It was this unprecedented worldwide collapse that brought international trade to an absolute standstill.
Now, it's time to myth bust a massive historical misconception. A lot of us tend to think that the 1929 stock market crash alone caused the Great Depression. And yes, absolutely, the drop was spectacular. But get this. In 1929, only about 2% of Americans actually owned stock. 2%. The crash wiped out immense wealth for the top 1%, sure, but for the rest of the country, it was primarily a psychological shock. It just caused everyone to panic and pull back on their spending. So the crash was a symptom, and it was definitely a trigger, but it wasn't the deepest root of the rot.
Moving right along to Section 2, Anatomy of Economic Collapse.
That initial psychological shock we just talked about, it quickly triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. In 1929, the market crashes. By 1930, everyday people are so spooked, they start yanking their cash out of banks. This sparks widespread banking panics, which drastically shrinks the money supply and eventually drives unemployment to an unfathomable 25% by 1933.
And this wasn't just some abstract spreadsheet error. These were real, panicked citizens rushing to withdraw their life savings. The fundamental issue was our fractional reserve banking system. Banks only keep a tiny fraction of deposits on hand as actual cash. So when everyone shows up at the exact same time, the bank literally runs out of money and goes under. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 1,000 U.S. banks closed every single year. Just gone.
So here is the absolutely critical point. Misguided policies actually made this crisis way worse. As economists like Milton Friedman pointed out later on, the Federal Reserve's rigid adherence to the gold standard and their choice to just let the nation's money supply collapse was devastating. Instead of injecting cash into the system to save the failing banks, they actually raised interest rates, and this created a ruthless deflationary spiral. Picture it like a drain. With less money circulating, prices drop. When prices drop, businesses make less money, so what do? They lay off workers. Unemployed workers can't pay their loans, which causes even more banks to fail. Round and round it goes, drilling the entire economy straight into the ground.
Let's think about what deflation actually looks like at the grocery store. Falling prices might sound pretty nice to us today, but back then, deflation utterly crushed businesses and farmers. A pound of chicken plummeted from 38 cents to just 12 cents. Eggs fell from 50 cents to 13 cents. So if you're a farmer, your income just vanished into thin air. But, and here's the real kicker, your mortgage and your debts, those stayed exactly the same. You literally just couldn't make a living anymore.
Which brings us to Section 3, Dust Bowl and Land Ethic.
As if the financial ruin wasn't enough, right? The Dust Bowl was not just a streak of bad weather. It was an ecological disaster, completely engineered by human behavior. During World War I, global demand for wheat skyrocketed. So American farmers met that demand by tearing up the deep-rooted prairie grasses of the Great Plains, basically turning it into a one-crop resource through incredibly aggressive farming practices. Fast forward to the 1930s when a severe drought hits. That aggressively overworked, unanchored topsoil simply turned into fine powder. The high winds whipped it up, creating these monstrous dust storms that literally turned farmland into a desert, displacing thousands of families in the process.
What's really fascinating from a historical perspective is how people reacted to this and how it fundamentally altered the American land ethic. Instead of stepping back and realizing,
hey, we pushed the ecosystem too far, the nation's initial philosophy was all about battling nature. Because they were fighting an economic depression with pure determination and grit, they tried to fight the environmental disaster the exact same way, with stubborn resistance, rather than trying to understand the environment and use moderation. It took decades of really painful lessons to finally shift federal policy toward actual conservation.
Let's shift gears to Section 4, the New Deal debate.
Now, traditional history books usually give us a pretty straightforward narrative, right? FDR's New Deal swooped in and saved the nation. And look, it is absolutely true that programs like the FDIC ended bank runs. Social Security provided a much-needed safety net, and massive public works significantly expanded the federal government's economic role while rebuilding our infrastructure. But modern macroeconomic scholars present a totally different view. They argue that specific regulations actually hindered the recovery. They point out that certain policies restricted competition, encouraged industrial cartels to keep prices artificially high, and raised wages way above market levels. This, they argue, might have actually discouraged businesses from hiring the millions of unemployed workers back.
Now, as an impartial explainer, we have to look fairly at all the data. Documents like this working paper from the Levy Economics Institute acknowledge this intense, ongoing scholarly debate. While defending the broader social achievements of the New Deal, even its strongest defenders often admit that specific pillars, like the 1933 National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, were deeply flawed and poorly administered. The main takeaway here isn't that the New Deal was 100% good or 100% bad. It's that intervening in a completely collapsed economy is incredibly messy, and some well-intentioned medicines might have actually prolonged the patient's fever.
And that leads us to our final part, Section 5, the long-term scars.
To really understand the aftermath of all this, we need to talk about a vital economic concept called hysteresis. Basically, this is the idea that a short-term shock leaves a permanent long-term scar. Think about it. When workers are unemployed for years, they lose their skills, they lose their professional networks. When businesses don't invest in new technology for an entire decade, the whole economy misses out on capabilities it should have naturally developed. The 1930s was essentially a lost decade that permanently altered the trajectory of American growth.
But how did this actually affect individuals on the ground? Well, analyzing newly linked historical census records from the LifeM database reveals an incredibly complex picture of social mobility. For teenagers during the Depression, the impacts were highly gendered. The data shows that the Depression uniquely limited opportunities for teenage girls. Many daughters were forced to drop out of school entirely to take on domestic roles, caring for younger siblings while their parents desperately scrounged for work. Meanwhile, teen sons from less educated families actually experienced a surprising increase in educational mobility in some areas. It just highlights how disruptive, catastrophic events shift family resources in completely unexpected ways.
And we have to remember, the pain was absolutely not distributed equally. Systemic inequities meant that minority groups suffered far, far worse. Black Americans, who were largely excluded from many New Deal benefits due to the politics of the era, faced significantly greater intergenerational setbacks. Larger families were stretched to the absolute breaking point. Really, the only mitigating factor for many was migration, just packing up everything and moving across state lines in a desperate search for better occupational opportunities. So we've covered the cascading bank failures, the ecological devastation of the Dust Bowl, the incredibly complex legacy of the New Deal, and the deep, deep scars left on an entire generation. I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. If economists today believe the Great Depression was largely exacerbated by misguided monetary policies, rather than just a natural failure of free markets, have we truly learned the right lessons? Because understanding the precise mechanics of our past, the mistakes just as much as the triumphs, is literally the only way to safeguard our future. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning the consensus and keep learning.